All right, I think it's going live here. Here we go. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu rasulillah. So I wanted to comment on something that I saw the other day. Living in some very interesting and reactionary times. And this was a comment by a public Muslim figure who works for a Muslim academic institution. And the reason why I'm not mentioning the person's name outright is because to me that isn't really the important thing, is to make it like personality against personality. And I think our community has enough of this as it is already. Wa alaikum salam. Our community has enough of all this, contest of wills and personalities against each other. But rather, I just want to address the ideology and the thought process. And so I had actually titled, at least the YouTube stream, I had titled it after this song on a Dexter Gordon album called "The End of a Love Affair." And I think that I would agree that the love affair that a certain contingent of our community has had with American liberalism, or liberalism in general, that's definitely needs to be over. Likewise, though, I think this kind of love affair that some Muslim figures and intellectuals, dare even say scholars, some imams have with American conservatism, also, I think it's time for it to be the end of a love affair. So any of the Dexter Gordon fans out there, you'll know what I'm talking about. So this person wrote what woke Muslim activists over the past 7 years or so looked like. So they were saying that, you've had and it's true, there's no doubt, there are definitely aspects or people within our community that would certainly fall on that spectrum of that you could label as liberal, that supported things like believe all women, and even ridiculously, there were some Muslims that supported the idea of sex work and whatnot. And clearly these things are a misguidance. But I also feel that those are easy, low-hanging fruit. Those are things that are pretty easy to lambast. Those are pretty easy to tear apart and pretty easy to criticize. But what really bothered me was the person's comment in which they said, "I wonder why so many conservatives see Muslims as a fifth column." Now, to me, this was just unbelievably irresponsible. That what you're saying is that the perception that conservatives have of Muslims is not in any way due to their own issues, right? Due to their lack of misguidance, and it is wholly due to this small fringe but increasingly very vocal segment of our community. Because I do not believe that the bulk of the Muslim community is at least this kind of extreme form of liberal in thought. Although I do believe that slowly Muslims are definitely becoming more inclined towards certain aspects of liberalism. But and even then, I think that's perhaps that term needs to be, maybe we need to find a new term, because it's become so ubiquitous in many ways it loses any efficacy and it just becomes kind of blasé. But what you're saying is that the view of Muslims being a fifth column, which means that somehow they stand against America or whatnot, that view has nothing to do with internally what's going on with conservatives, and is all wholly based upon the Muslims. It's their fault. Secondly, that this view, according to this kind of statement, would almost give credence to that view, that indeed Muslims really are a fifth column, which I think now you're sort of like siding with the conservatives, which I think is also very, very troubling, and also quite ridiculous. And that third, that's something new that before perhaps conservatives had a better view of Muslims, and that it's only gone downhill again due to the fault of the Muslims. And I think this is kind of intellectually sloppy as well as dishonest, and also shows a lack of depth, and that this love affair that we have, or some of us have developed this love affair with American conservatism, also needs to be analyzed. That essentially the only thing wrong with conservatives is that they just haven't accepted the light of Islam, right? That's the only thing that we can say that is wrong with American conservatives, is that they view their morality is right, but their aqidah is wrong. Their morality is right because they agree with us, and they have the same general view on things, say like traditional family values or homosexuality or something like that. But of course, they believe that God has a kid. They believe that God came in the form of a man. So they just have a few things that are off. But generally speaking, they're okay. But these liberals, boy, they're really so horrible. And I think what this, especially when it comes from the mouth of a person that's, perceived to be a person of knowledge, is that it sort of a little too clumsily lends credence overall to the whole enterprise of American conservatism, which has a whole bunch of things that are absolutely despicable. One is the deification of the military, the deification of the nation state. The ends justifies the means when it comes to war and carnage, and then also finding some measure of esteem when the very same gaze that looks back upon you from them looks with you at complete contempt. And in fact, there's no room for you in the world of American, at least as it stands now. There's really no room in the worldview of conservatism for Muslims, and that I would say just as much as you would have, an old school liberal that is definitely nothing like the liberals of today. Which I wouldn't even call these people liberal. I would just call them, heathens. They're hedonistic. It's a completely decadent, hedonistic worldview where nothing is held sacred. Where that's not the case with liberals, even just going back, 30, 40, 50, of course, even more, 60, 100 years ago. Absolutely not. And also the same with the conservatives of 50, 60, 70 years ago bear very little resemblance to the conservatives that we find today. But I just find this a very disturbing line of thought. Continuing, there amongst those who posted black squares during the Summer of Love. Okay, again, I would love to know like what kinds of numbers, because I think that anyone today that's going to espouse this hedonistic, hyper-liberal worldview is, of course, going to get the mic, because they are serving, they're serving the purposes of shaitan. They're usually serving some type of corporate sponsorship, and so, follow the money. That's always there. And so those things can't be completely disassociated from it. But again, I think that because of the role of social media and those things, those voices can be somewhat artificially amplified, and then also say, not even to say conservative, but more normative Muslim voices are of course quite on the opposite end of the spectrum, are completely shut down and shuttered, and so you don't hear them. So again, I think that like when he's talking about things like the vaccine or Ukraine, I mean, I know most Muslims that I knew, a large segment of Muslims that I knew, either were somewhat skeptical on those topics, if not downright opposed to them. But again, I think it's hard to get an accurate measure of where the pulse of the community was because of, if you were a person that wanted to articulate those views, you wouldn't be able to do so, at least through any, social media channel. He said, these people believe their protests against the Palestinian suffering will act like a social shahada. Now, this is where, again, the problem, I feel like this is just hyperbole. This is exaggeration. I have not seen whatsoever, and again, I mean, I think this is where I wanted to make the point, is that we are using secular, godless political nomenclature, liberal, conservative, to then weaponize that to legitimize or delegitimize fellow Muslims religiously. So a person goes out to protest, and because they have a heartfelt, they are heartfelt as a believing Muslim, that they see what's going on, and I already talked about this in a podcast in another video. They in terms of, can you protest as a Muslim or not? I mean, these are things that are obviously going to be debated, and that there's nothing qat'i thabut. There's nothing that comes down, boom, not like a ham sandwich. Can you or can you not have a ham sandwich? There's no real conversation on this, right? Where in this case, there is a conversation. We may not want there to be one, or we may wish to try to banish any conversation from the periphery because it happens to go against our political views that we mix with our sensibilities as a Muslim, but that just ain't the case. So to say, because a person goes out as a believing Muslim because they care about what's going on in Palestine, and they care about what this country is doing with its, money and its tax, all these things, that now they're making that equivalent to somehow a social shahada. I think that this kind of language is unbecoming of a religious scholar, somebody that should be a bit more, a bit more discerning in their application of it. I'm not trying to say you cannot criticize the protesters. Have at it. I've even had, in the podcast that we did last week, I did voice and express some concerns about Muslims rushing out headlong without clear irshad, without clear guidance, with clear objectives, with clear strategy, tactics. I said all that. That being said, I would not go to the point of disparaging somebody that, as if you're saying that they're now like making a bid'ah, right? Because that's when you say that they're making a social shahada, right? These people believing their protests against the Palestinian suffering will act like a social shahada, which will erase their misdeeds and make us forget their efforts. See, now you're making this equivalent to some type of kafara, like you're saying that it's like a kind of bid'ah, like literally the technical term, the religious technical term, it's a religious innovation, that they're concocting something new in the religion. Somebody feeling that because what they see going on resonates with their beliefs as a Muslim and going out to do those things, I don't think that's fair to say or accurate to say that they are making this into a social shahada. Again, I think you could critique what they're doing in terms of the validity of it, the efficacy of it, the hikmah, the wisdom. I think you could do all that without having to go to something quite to this extent. Just simply critique it and stick to that without having to, without having to go to these kinds of extremes. Because to me, the real concerning thing is that your fellow Muslim, who is a Muslim, your fellow Muslim, even if they are misguided in their execution of wanting to express solidarity with the Palestinians and their concern over what's going on, even if they are misguided in their execution of that and going out and protesting, even if they're doing that, they're still a Muslim. But for you to find more commonality and to express sympathy with the kuffar, which are the American conservatives, with no mistake, they are 100% kuffar, and they are aduwallah. They are the enemies of Allah because they are the ones that are supporting the war effort, not just this time around, but for the past umpteen decades. They've been supporting incursions not only into the Muslim lands, but into non-Muslim lands. They have been the force supporting that. And so for an imam or a scholar to express sympathy with those and to essentially give them a rukhsa or a kind of dispensation or give them a hall pass, well, I can see why they see Muslims in that kind of light. But then you find nothing credible, nothing worthy in the efforts of your fellow Muslim, even if what they're doing is perhaps sometimes somewhat misguided or they make a mistake. To me, I think that is really the part that I'm most concerned about with this love affair that some have with American conservatism, is that I just think these kind of people need to seriously check where their head and their heart is at. When I saw this, it made me stop in my tracks, and I'm like, man, where are we going? We are now using the istilahat, right? We're now using the political nomenclature of the kuffar to slice and dice each other up into different groups, to strip each other of value, and to further erode any sense of unity. But then now we're going to use that same godless nomenclature. We're going to use that same terminology to actually find some commonality with those that do not believe in Allah alone, perhaps don't even believe in hereafter, and unabashedly exhibit hostility to the annihilation of Muslims. I mean, I really don't understand how a person can slip so far. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't things that I've read many of the writings of classical conservatism throughout the last couple hundred years, particularly American conservatism, and undoubtedly there are things in their writings and in their thoughts that you can find admirable, that you can find worthy of consideration. But not to the point that I will begin to sympathize with them, most certainly over my fellow Muslims. Let's see, Jordan said, we are so far from the market, not funny, not saying you or me, but the overwhelming majority of Muslims really don't know what's happening. Allah help us. Well, that could be. Well, I wonder, though, why maybe so many Muslims perhaps don't know what's going on if their leaders are currently having an affair with American conservatism, right? And this would be you could say the exact same thing, right? If our thought leaders and religious leaders are also embroiled in having a love affair with American liberalism or liberalism in general, right? I think that doesn't bode well for the awam, for the generality of the Muslims, because if this is who is going to be, providing guidance for us, and they're too busy, batting eyelashes at some liberal or conservative, behind closed doors, so to speak, this does not bear well, for us in general. And I think it makes it very easy for American Muslims to be confused. In fact, what I think it does is it sends the message to perhaps the average, Muslim, is that I've got to pick one of these camps to reside in. I've got to pick the lesser of two evils. I'm either going to cozy up with a liberal. Yeah, I mean, they got their whole thing with the LGBTQ or this or that or whatever. But, okay, they're going to support Palestine. right? Even though it's queers for Palestine, or the reverse, right? I'm going to cozy up with the conservatives because even though they definitely have a bloodlust, right, for for Muslim bodies, they have a bloodlust for militarism, but their view on homosexuality nicely overlaps with mine, so I'll cozy up with them. So I think that I think that sends the wrong messaging to the community as a whole. Is that you gotta pick a team. It's like this year I was really hoping that the Lions were going to make it to the Super Bowl, and so as we all know, the Lions didn't make it to the Super Bowl. And so when the Super Bowl happens, people are like, well, who do you want to win? I was like, I don't really care. I no longer have a dog in this fight. Um, and they're like, no, even though they lost to San Francisco, don't you want to? I said, no, man, I have no dog in this fight now. And I think that we have to be very careful as leaders. And I don't care whether you are a major, minor, you have great influence, you got 100 followers, you have 100 million followers, right? If you're in that position, whether you would influence one person or 101 persons or 1,001 persons, I think you have to be very careful of what trophies we create in the minds of our fellow Muslims, of which they will perhaps even subconsciously chase after and pursue. So I really feel like that's why I quoted that Dexter Gordon song. I think it's the end of a love affair now. We need to put aside these, and we need to craft our own political nomenclature based upon the Book of Allah and the guidance of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. I really think that's what we need to do, and have a team huddle, and also make space so that we can have legitimate differences. We can have ikhtilaf in a way that will not cause that will be the khilaf al-ittihad, right? We want to have space where we can have legitimate differences of opinion, also recognizing that our when we are discussing things of which they are not qat'i tabut, rather not things that revelation puts the conversation to an end, then we're going to have to be willing to acknowledge that, well, I might feel very passionately about this thing, and I can have all of my, adillah, I can have all of my proofs based upon this or that, but it's still the formulation from a flawed, finite, limited human being. And so we've got to make space to do that, versus chopping each other up for the pleasure of shaitan, chopping each other up over for the pleasure of these kuffar, that at the end of it, whether it's with the liberal or the conservative, none of them will shed a tear when we are the inhabitants of the fire, or when we have lost our way in this dunya, or that we have lost the akhirah. None of them will shed a tear over that. So anyway, I just wanted to hopefully, and again, I'm not mentioning anybody's name in particular, because what really frustrates me about sometimes trying to have these conversations is that once you draw the particular person into it, then it becomes this, spectacle. And I'm not interested in that. I'm just simply interested in critiquing and challenging that particular view on something. So anyway, it is 11:15, and actually we'll be on today, inshallah. Normally we do Wednesdays, but we'll be on a little bit later today, 5 p.m. for the Middle Ground podcast. So I got to get ready, pack all my stuff up, inshallah, and get ready for that. So hope to see you in a little bit. وصلوات الله تعالى على النبي الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.